This episode of The Reality Check is brought to you by HelloFresh. Forget takeout. HelloFresh delivers all the ingredients for delicious, healthy meals anyone can prepare at home in less than 30 minutes. And HelloFresh is giving our Canadian checkers 50% off their first order. Go to hellofresh.ca and use promo code REALITY50 to get 50% off your first order. That's hellofresh.ca, promo code REALITY50.
This episode of The Reality Check is brought to you by FreshBooks. FreshBooks is a ridiculously easy-to-use cloud accounting software for small business owners that saves you time and gets you paid faster. Now used by over 10 million people worldwide. For your free 30-day trial, go to freshbooks.com/therealitycheck and enter Reality Check in the How Did You Hear About Us section.
This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is the show for November 14th, 2017, and I'm your host, Darren McKee. With me, as usual, are Adam Gardner.
What's up, Cuboids?
Cristina Roach.
Hello.
And producer Pat.
Hi, everyone.
We have a great show for you today. Cristina is going to explore the world of election signs. And then Adam is going to investigate whether the word Allah was found at a Viking burial site.
That's right.
But first, I'm going to explore the very non-controversial topic of age of consent.
Oh boy.
Given the ongoing reports of various men harassing or sexually assaulting people, and most recently the case of Roy Moore, who may have pursued a 14-year-old years ago, I ended up thinking about the issue of age of consent and wanted to share some very brief thoughts, just sort of exploring the topic. Now, some qualifiers. I know this is a taboo topic, and people can react very strongly to any sort of discussion, aside from saying this is black and white and there's a right and a wrong. I'm not going to argue to lower the age of consent, or even for a particular age of consent, or even weigh in on current issues. I'm not a lawyer or an ethicist, as much as I probably want to be an ethicist. Why I think this topic hits a nerve is that it deals with two interacting and highly concerning realms. Children, who are generally the most vulnerable among us, and sexual exploitation, one of the worst things it can do to a person. That said, as you've heard me say on the show before, I don't think we'll make better decisions by being less informed and thinking less about an issue. My motivation is partly from my recollection of the book Perv, which I think is great, and I wanted to explore how the age of consent is different in different countries, how the ages of both parties become relevant, and other aspects of the issue. So let's get into the topic gradually. Most countries have a defined age by which a citizen is allowed to drive, drink, vote, and serve in the military. These ages are almost never the same within a country, and they differ greatly across countries.
Yeah.
I always found it interesting that our neighbors to the south in the US think it makes sense to empower a citizen to be able to kill others in war, but still they're irresponsible enough to drink. What a country!
And I think that it bleeds over oddly into popular culture, where you watch movies where kids get in trouble for drinking in college, and I'm like, I don't understand.
Yeah,
What's
I know.
the problem?
I know. And you could make that case, like, why in Canada is the age of voting different than the age of driving, different than... It's just, someone decided this. There's some history and context, but it's not always based on consistent reasoning.
Yep.
Wikipedia had a great entry about this, and quoting that, the term age of consent rarely appears in legal statutes. Generally, a law will instead establish the age below which it is illegal to engage in sexual activity with that person. It has sometimes been used with other meanings, such as the age at which a person becomes competent to consent to marriage. Quick note, I'm not really going into the issues about consent in marriage. Certain countries don't really have an age of consent, but you have to be old enough and you have to be married for any sort of sexual activity.
Oh.
That's at the far end of the spectrum. Not most countries in the world, but there are some.
Interesting.
Another quotation from Wikipedia. Age of consent laws were, historically, difficult to follow and enforce. Legal norms based on age were not, in general, common until the 19th century, because clear proof of exact age and precise date of birth were often unavailable. Which is also interesting. I can even imagine, like, how old are you? Like, I don't know. I don't know. My parents don't really know. I don't know. I'm 11 or 12, or I'm 10, I'm 20, 21.
Yeah, I'm like 37 to 40 winters. I'm not really
Exactly.
sure.
Exactly. I don't know. I slept really long one winter. Was that 1 or 2? Now, at root, it seems that the age of consent is about capability. Duh. Like many other ages of responsibility, it seems to rest on the belief that the older someone is, the more likely they are to make a better decision. Seem accurate so far?
Somewhat.
I think this is true in general, and society has to have some sort of cutoff, right? We have to make laws.
Sure.
But the other factor involved is whether there's an age difference between the partners. And the concern appearing to be that the older person may be using their, comparatively, advanced understanding and power to take advantage of someone. In this particular case, the older someone is, the more likely they are to make a bad decision for the other party and society. While this may seem in contradiction, I think it is more about nuance, and it can be resolved if one looks at overall impact. But I do think there's an interesting tension there where you're smarter, you'll make better decisions. Oh, wait, no, not you. You're going to take advantage of someone.
Yeah.
Wikipedia has an informative and easily sortable chart where they rank all of the countries by age of consent for male and female, for hetero and homosexual activity, and if there are or are not restrictions. Highly recommend you check it out. Follow the link at our show notes, trcpodcast.com. To share a high-level overview of some of the findings, Italy, Brazil, Austria, and many others set the age at 14. South Korea is actually 13. I can't help but find this a little surprising and emotionally disturbing, and such is the power of cultural upbringing. Now, France, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland, as well as various others, are set at 15. Now, just today, I read an article that said France is considering it, making it 13, within the realm of 13 to 15. So what I'm thinking now is Wikipedia had a general overview of what seems to be the case in France, but France is now going to make it explicit. I believe the issue is someone had sex with someone who was much younger, and they weren't sure if that counted as rape or child molestation, because it's like a different type of thing depending on which part of the law one is going to apply. Now, given that this is a Canadian podcast, I thought that this line in the Wikipedia entry was especially relevant. Quote, some jurisdictions have laws explicitly allowing sexual acts with minors under the age of consent if their partner is close in age to them.
Yeah.
For instance, in Canada, the age of consent is 16, but there are two close in age exemptions. Sex with minors aged 14 to 15 is permitted if the partner is less than 5 years older, and sex with minors aged 12 to 13 is permitted if the partner is less than 2 years older.
I think this is commonly called like a Romeo and Juliet law, right?
I'm not sure.
That's what they refer to it in the Transformers.
It's commonly called a Romeo and Juliet law.
This means that in Canada, an 18-year-old could have sex with a 14-year-old and it would be legal. That said, there are often issues of differential power and resources if there was ever to be an issue with that legally, one way or another. Generally, the idea of two 12-year-olds having sex with each other seems to me like a bad idea, but it's interesting to think that it's legal. Would the alternative be putting both of them in jail for consensual activity? That doesn't seem right either. Additionally, I have two conflicting feelings about such young people engaging in intimacy. I know many adults make bad decisions in many domains of their life. These children are just so young, and I realize that's not an argument, it's just a statement. Yeah. So first, I would wish they'd be older, but if that's reasonable, it might be better if at least one of the parties was older, because then that person would be better able to make decisions. Say a 14-year-old and a 12-year-old. But then that raises my concerns about a differential power and being taken advantage of. Yeah. And this harkens back to my earlier statement, the older you are, the more likely you are to make a better decision, except when you're not and more able to harm others.
Well, it's not so much them making a bad decision as being able to take advantage of someone's poor judgment, I guess, if that makes sense.
Right, enabling a bad decision.
Yeah.
The book Perv raised another interesting point. In many places, chronological age is what matters, not equivalent mental age. So you might have a highly intelligent and capable 15-year-old that cannot consent, if the age of consent, say, is 16, but someone who is in their late 20s and suffers from some sort of mental retardation can. Again, society needs general rules, and perhaps there are some mitigating circumstances that are brought into play if a legal issue is raised, but it seems like such laws will never be smooth or fully satisfying to all parties. I don't have much to conclude, as it was more I was just presenting some thoughts and ideas. I think we'd all agree that some number would be too high and some number would be too low. But does anyone truly think that there's an objectively true number that is always applicable? And that all countries in the present, and at different times in history in the past, and in the future, would be wrong if they didn't have that number? That's what Perv really highlighted. Yep. That said, we do need laws, and we have to have some number that approximate current societal values and understanding of psychosocial development. Perhaps the tiered approach with special exemptions like in Canada is the way to go? Like even life expectancy, lifespan, does that come into play? Because you imagine hundreds of years ago, if people lived to a shorter age, if children were working when they were 8 years old, it might just have a whole different frame of reference. And nowadays, for the most part, child labor is illegal. I think acting is almost the only loophole. Right. But beyond that, you can't have kids work. And then maybe that matures them differently. Maybe you're in a tribal society. You're like, you're out hunting when you're 9 and you're expected to be self-sufficient by the time you're 12. Yeah. I don't really know.
So I thought about this a little bit when you mentioned that you were doing this segment. And I thought, is it when someone is in like a senior in high school? Is that the point that they're mature enough for this? Like, what's the yardstick? And it sounds like there isn't a really good one, and lots of countries struggle with this stuff.
It depends how you're looking at it. If people look at it as, when's the earliest I would have thought that I should have been able to have sex versus when do I think it's appropriate for my children to have sex? And they might think that's a totally different number. So maybe ask yourself, where's that number coming from, and what are you really
Right.
getting it from?
Well, Adam, now that you have a daughter, especially, is that not something that resonates with you differently, hearing this segment and hearing what Darren's saying about how young someone can be?
Yeah, I mean, my attitude has always tried to be, and whether this changes or not, we'll see, is that it's her decision to do whatever she wants, and if she thinks that that's a mistake, it's her mistakes to learn from. The flip side of that, obviously, is I wouldn't want anyone to pressure her into doing anything she wouldn't want to. Yeah, I think there's that kind of cliche of I'm the father and you got to do this and it's my rules and all this, and I think that's just kind of a bad attitude to have, and I understand the place that comes from, but we can kind of overcome some of those baser emotions, and to just say, like, you're make your own decisions and do what you think is right.
And now something just as controversial, election signs. Cristina.
There's been a lot of jibber-jabber about elections lately, and I'm not referring to the one where you know who was elected. Here in Ontario, Canada, we have a contentious provincial election coming up in 2018. And currently in the US, various regional elections are making headlines for a myriad of reasons, some of them not so great, evinced by Darren's segment earlier. A few weeks ago, we got an email from a checker named Ernie. It seems to be that time once again when all the boulevards in town are polluted with campaign signs for the local election. I was wondering if there have ever been studies done on just how effective these signs are, if at all. He does add, I'm sure I could probably Google the answer myself, but I would enjoy it much more if someone else could do the work and then just confirm my biases for me. Well, you're in luck, Ernie. Rewinding just for a sec. Campaign signs are those advertising signs placed on one's property to express support for an election candidate or political position. Between 1984 and 2012, one study showed the use of lawn signs in political campaigns had quadrupled. During Canada's federal campaign where Trudeau was elected, our neighborhood was certainly littered with signs. So are all of these campaign signs effective at influencing our voting, and perhaps even enough to swing a close election? Imagine how useful this information would be to a campaign manager. Now, as Philip Bump says in the Washington Post, quote, no one loves lawn signs more than political candidates. 1, they love seeing their name around. 2, they assume that the number of lawn signs they see somehow correlates to the level of support they enjoy. Campaign managers, on the other hand, not as fond of them. They often view campaign signs as a waste of time and money. There are logistical challenges, as you guys can imagine, in distributing these signs. It's expensive, and they just don't see any evidence that the signs accomplish anything. A campaign manager likes to work with measurable effects, like targeting supporters or advertising that's proven effective in past elections. In a 2012 article, Lane Wallace of The Atlantic asked communications directors if they felt seeing a yard sign ever changed a single voter's opinion. Without hesitation, Kevin Frank, communications director of the Massachusetts Democratic Party at the time, answered no. There's a very common saying among political operatives. Lawn signs don't vote. A lot of signs might be a sign that a candidate is doing well, but they're not doing well because of those signs. Tim Buckley, the comms director of the Massachusetts Republican Party at the same time of the article, agreed. And he added, quote, I would love to see a study that says point blank that they're ineffective because that would make campaign workers' lives so much easier. That said, a study was published late 2015 in Electoral Studies, a quarterly peer-reviewed academic journal that covers research into elections. Lead author Donald Green of Columbia University and his colleagues sought out to measure effects of signs on vote outcomes, and they conducted the first 4 randomized field trials of lawn signs. They conducted the study during 4 races at the federal, state, and local level. And Green's been working to assess the utility of various methods of voter outreach for decades, so not his first day at the rodeo. Here's an excerpt from the study abstract. Although lawn signs rank among the most widely used campaign tactics, little scholarly attention has been paid to the question of whether they actually generate votes. Working in collaboration with a congressional candidate, a mayoral candidate, an independent expenditure campaign directed against a gubernatorial candidate, which means a state governor or the office of the state governor, and a candidate for county commissioner, we tested the effects of lawn signs by planting them in randomly selected voting precincts. So the first 3 experiments consisted of sign placement in public places. The 4th experiment consisted of placing signs on voters' yards, which is typically an area campaigns spend a lot of time coordinating. Question for you guys. Actually, a 2-part question. Do you think the lawn signs increased voter share? And if so, by how many percentage points on average?
Hi all, producer Pat here. We'll get back to the show in a second, but first a few words about our sponsors. We've used HelloFresh a few times now, and it really is pretty cool. A box shows up at your front door with step-by-step instructions and exactly the right amount of ingredients. There's no waste, just delicious meals. They do all the planning and shopping, you do the cooking. If you want to give it a try, HelloFresh is giving our Canadian checkers 50% off their first order. Go to hellofresh.ca and use the promo code REALITY50.
Hey checkers, if you're a freelancer or small business owner like me, you know how much accounting can suck up valuable time. FreshBooks makes ridiculously easy to use cloud accounting software that simplifies things like invoicing, tracking expenses, and receiving payments online. You can even take photos of receipts on your phone using FreshBooks mobile apps to make claiming expenses easier. Right now, you can try a 30-day unrestricted free trial with no credit card required by going to freshbooks.com/reality check and typing reality check in the How Did You Hear About Us section.
All right, back to the show. So I would think by the sheer number that you see in any election, it's got to have some influence, even if it's just name recognition.
Okay. How about you guys?
I think Pat dodged the question.
I would think that yes, but I don't know that I could give a percentage because I would assume that percentage would vary with the number of signs.
So you think it goes up, though? It correlates. Is that what you're saying? More signs,
somewhat.
more percentage?
Maybe it plateaus at some point. Maybe there's diminishing returns, but I think it's going to correlate somewhat.
So my first thought is no, it doesn't. But then I thought, yes, it does. But I don't know. It might increase voter turnout, but may not change the percentages. Because the signs might be battling each other and like, oh, look at all these signs. I better have a sign on my lawn, and I better show up. And that person thinks they better show up, and then it doesn't really change anything, ratio-wise.
I would also say it could potentially make a difference when there's a lot of candidates that aren't necessarily tied to a party. So if there are, say, 8 people running, and I only really see signs for 3, maybe when I'm deciding to vote, I'm going to say, well, maybe the ones that I'm seeing signs for are kind of the real ones, and then the other ones are just like, you know, the kind of crapshoot guy who's running, but he doesn't really have a campaign and no one really supports him, if that makes sense. So maybe on the lower end, it weeds out some people.
Well, Green found the lawn signs did, in fact, increase voter share, but only by 1.7 percentage points on average. Interestingly, the effects of placing signs in people's yards were essentially zero.
Wow.
Aggregating the results of the 4 experiments suggested a 1.7 percentage point boost to the candidate from the signs, with a standard error of 0.7 percentage points.
But for some races, that matters,
Oh, yeah.
right? 1%.
Yeah, we'll get there.
Okay.
Said the researchers, it appears that signs typically have a modest effect on advertising candidates' vote shares, an effect that is probably greater than 0 but unlikely to be large enough to alter the outcome of a contest that would otherwise be decided by more than a few percentage points. Their conclusion? This finding puts lawn signs on par with other low-tech campaign tactics, such as direct mail, that generate reliable persuasion effects that tend to be small in magnitude. Co-author Alex Kopic had a more positive spin on the results, telling Politico, quote, "The effect is small in terms of percentage points, though the implication is that thousands of voters would have voted for someone else if not for the signs." He says, "My guess is that part of the reason that the effect is small is because any campaign tactic, signs, ads, mailers, calls, etc., only move people around at that margin. In many ways, it would be strange if the effect were bigger. Imagine a world in which the presence or absence of lawn signs could swing an election by 10 points. Now, to put the percentage in some context for you guys, in the span of 2006 and 2012, where there were around 6,000 general and primary elections in the House and Senate races in the U.S., only 2.2% of them were within a 1.7 percentage point range. So a lawn sign bump could matter in about 1 in 50 races. So the effect is small, but the study's results are difficult for a campaign manager to argue against when a political candidate demands on using campaign signs to help boost his or her margin. At least the campaign managers can take some comfort that the study suggests signs in random public places are more effective than the much more time-intensive canvassing of supporters to prop up signs in their yards. So there you have it, Ernie. As the Washington Post put it, lawn signs are only 98.3% useless.
That idea of putting signs in public actually makes a lot of sense to me, because when I'm commuting, driving, or even people on the bus, as they might be, you see a lot of signs on the side of the road or at big intersections and things like that. But if you have a sign in front of your house, unless you live on a huge street that's highly traveled, almost no one's going to see it. Like, where I live is just kind of the end of a road, and you don't really go to it unless you're going to that specific road. Mm-hmm. Well, no one's knocking down my door to put a campaign sign on my front lawn. So yeah, it kind of makes sense that the thing I'm staring at when I'm sitting at a red light is going to get a little more action than something in front of someone's house on a little cul-de-sac.
Aren't we covering up the real purpose of lawn signs? To alienate your neighbors and know who not to invite to your Christmas party?
Or to have children embarrassed by the choice of the sign that their parents put, so then they have something that they put in their bedroom window that says, like, my parents are douchebags because they're voting for XYZ. Stuff like that.
One of the articles had a photo of a lawn that had a Romney and Ryan sign from that particular election, and right beside that election sign was a handmade sign that said, "Husband's opinion, not wife's and son's," pointing to that sign. So I imagine it's very divisive even within a household.
For sure.
It's interesting to think that in ancient elections for Vikings, some of the signs said Allah. Adam, isn't that what you're going to talk about tonight?
Absolutely not, Darren.
Excellent. So what are you going to talk about?
I'm going to talk about whether or not the word Allah was found at a Viking burial site. You tell me what you think after hearing these headlines. From the New York Times. Allah is found on Viking funeral clothes. The Guardian. University claims Viking burial clothes women with Allah discovered in Sweden. The BBC. Why did Vikings have Allah embroidered into funeral clothes? The Independent. Researchers find name of Allah woven into ancient Viking burial fabrics. And the Daily Mail. Arabic text Allah uncovered in Viking burial clothing. Well, it seems that the media reports from major news outlets are all on the same page. These stories are all still online despite some other evidence. Many other less prominent outlets also reported on the issue. Some of them agreed, some of them had other things to say. The story, as it was originally claimed by many, is quite simple. Annika Larsson of Uppsala University was re-examining the remnants of burial costumes from boat and chamber graves which were excavated in Birka and Gamla Uppsala in Sweden in the late 19th and early 20th century. She was surprised by the geometry of the pattern on a material which she hadn't seen before. She recalled seeing a similar design in Spain on Moorish textiles. Such scripts were generally found in Central Asia. She then determined that this must have been an ancient Arabic Kufic script. She deciphered the word Ali and some other word. Ali was the name of the fourth caliph of Islam. He is said to be the cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad. She discovered that it also said Allah in mirrored letters. She believes that the findings show that Viking Age burial customs were influenced by Islamic ideas, such as eternal life in paradise after death, because there are so few cultures with ideas of eternal life in paradise. She discounts the idea that these may simply be plundered goods, as is often the explanation for such findings, because this is inscribed on typical Viking Age clothes. So it wasn't something that would have been taken from a Muslim person, but either a Viking sort of appropriating that or a Muslim Viking. There is much silk in Viking grave sites, for example, which fits with the passage in the Quran, which says that inhabitants of paradise will wear garments of silk. An update to the original news article from the Uppsala University clarifies that these are preliminary results to be presented at an exhibition and that they will be peer-reviewed and published at a later date. Well, the future is now, because one such peer, Stephanie Mulder, a professor of medieval Islamic art and archaeology at University of Texas, Austin, has some thoughts on this piece. She first did a 60-tweet takedown on Twitter.com. If only she'd waited a few weeks, she could have done that same thing in only 30 tweets.
Nice.
She later wrote a proper article capturing the same thoughts in a much more human-readable format. She doesn't believe the textile says Allah on it at all, and it looks like she can actually back that up. So what's the issue here? The script used on the band is said to be Kufic, which is quite old, dating back to at least the 7th century, while this textile dates to the 10th century. The problem is that this inscription is in square Kufic, a more recent form of Kufic, which to a modern observer seems almost pixelated. It's mostly composed of squares, which makes it ideal to be used in architecture, such as being written out in tiles. This works well when embroidered in a textile, because again, you can have that sort of pixelated look as we see in the pattern. You can see pictures of the pattern in many of the links at our website, trcpodcast.com. So what's the issue? Square Kufic's earliest examples are from the 11th century, and the form in this particular drawing evolved in Iran and Central Asia in the Timurid period between 1370 and 1526. This became widespread in the Safavid era from 1501 to 1736. So it's about 500 years earlier than it should be expected. More specifically, the final character shown has the Arabic letter Ha with a hook over it, which is unique to a post-15th century form of Kufic. There are other issues with it as well. Were this actually Kufic writing, it wouldn't actually say Allah, but Allah, which Stephanie Mulder states is a nonsense Arabic word. The first letter is not an A or Aleph, but an L or Lam. While these two letters are close to one another, Aleph doesn't connect to the letter following it, but Lam does. She states that arguing that Lala and Allah are the same word is like saying that Dodd and God are the same. Need more? Well, there's another problem, which is obvious from looking at any article on the issue. This was put forward by Carolyn Priest-Dorman, who runs the A String Geeks Stash blog, which is all about knitting, weaving, and textiles, and things like that. There's blogs about that. Surprised what you see on the internet. She points out that the pattern is extrapolated beyond the width of the band. Looking at images, this is evident as we see a narrow band featuring the patterns, such as a number of swastikas, and then a part which supposedly says Allah, which is almost twice as wide. The part which doesn't cross the boundary is actually a very simple pattern, which looks something like an uppercase E, with the main edge extended a bit, like a double F, if that makes any sense. She then goes into a very technical explanation about the way it was half linen, half silk woven, and that the technique used would not have allowed for anything wider than the band, than what was accounted for because of a metallic weft turning into selvages. And I'll be honest, I don't even know what a lot of those words mean, but if you check out her blog post in the show notes, there appears to be a very thorough explanation of why this is so by someone who knows a bit more about the topic and can probably understand what this is about. And some of the comments seem to agree that it makes sense, and some of these comments are by other people who are in this culture who are interested in the same kind of hobby. So, why did this topic spread so easily if it was not really that accurate? Many news outlets and people who helped make these reports go viral may have been drawn in by the idea that Vikings were influenced by Muslim culture, or that a Viking could actually have been Muslim. It seems that some white nationalists, such as some of those who marched in Charlottesville, use medieval imagery and symbolism. This includes Viking symbolism, as there's this idea that Vikings and other medieval cultures were primarily white. Were this a true artifact, it is something which would counter this kind of idea. Some people like little more than to stick it to white nationalists. But as Stephanie Mulder states, there is ample evidence of Muslim and other influences on Viking culture. She mentions burial sites including a Buddha from India and a Coptic ladle from North Africa, as well as Arabic coins from Baghdad. Beyond direct artifacts from the Arabic world and elsewhere, we also see what she refers to as pseudo-Kufic, a sort of poorly copied Kufic script, and this is found throughout the Viking world. This reminds me a bit of the sorts of funny broken English texts you might see on a product in Japan or elsewhere in Asia, so that those who live there might think it gives it a foreign mystique, but people who actually read English think it looks a little weird. Mulder suggests that Arabic was a sign of social status and compares it to a modern-day perfume that might say Paris on it or something like that. So while this particular artifact is demonstrably not Muslim, the idea of such an item fits with what we know about Vikings. Now, many right-wing sites have taken this takedown and run with it, all the while ignoring the truth that there are many similar examples throughout the Viking world. Now, ultimately, we don't need to use this historical precedent to dictate modern political beliefs. White nationalists don't believe what they do because Viking culture was homogeneously white, and those advocating for diversity and acceptance of Muslims in the West don't believe that to be valid only because 1,000 years ago, the Vikings were also accepting of Arab cultures. History is full of bad examples that we should use as cautionary tales to avoid repeating, and others that turned out to be just fine. Today's political situations are modern issues, and we don't need a 1,000-year-old precedent to dictate what we do today. So no, a 10th century Viking textile does not have a law written on it. The script, square kufik, is 500 years too early. It doesn't actually say Allah, and there isn't even room on the band for it. So it seems like it's just an attractive pattern, including swastikas, which at the time had no association with the Nazis, who wouldn't exist for a millennia. There were Muslim influences on Viking culture, and were such an artifact to have existed, it would not be inconsistent with what historians know about the time period, but the simple fact is, this piece is not what it's claimed to be.
You wouldn't know it by all those headlines.
No, and you guys saw some of these headlines, right? It's
For sure.
This was something that was definitely making the rounds for a while.
Shame on the more respectable news outlets. I mean, shame on the other ones too, but I expect less.
Sure, they have less money and they have less professional people working.
Well, thank you, Adam. And thanks for joining us once again. I explored the realm of age of consent and else thorny issues. Cristina showed us that election signs are typically not that effective, but once in a while they might actually turn an election differently. The Viking sign from the 10th century did not contain the word Allah, and unsurprisingly, people appropriated something which may or may not be true for their own current political narrative and belief. Until next time, think better to act better.
Peace out, cuboids.
Stay classy, not smart-assy.
Good night, everyone.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at TRC_podcast.
Outtakes.
And that woman, Amelia Earhart.
And now you know the rest of the story.
Nope, I just wasn't sure if that was your segue.
Okay.
It's pretty weak, but anyway.